The agency of the Syrians sometimes gets lost when we talk about the international powers. The Syrian conflict may have been frozen, but it wasn't finished. The reason Assad was able to survive for so long was because of Hezbollah.
There's been some unease about the nature of HDS.
Once you have oppression, the fall of the state is inevitable. Where has Syria been a threat to the Israelis in any way whatsoever?
The Syrian Revolution began in 2011 as a grassroots civil society uprising against one of the most tyrannical rulers in the Muslim world. Bashar al-Assad, like his father before him, presided over a state of terror with disappearances, secret police repression, and a punitive state machinery that governed through fear. The demands of the public were snuffed out by a deranged dictator who decided he would burn his country before giving up power. We thought the revolution had ended and the millions of Syrians dispersed around the world were never going to see their homeland again. This has all spectacularly changed in this past week, where to everyone's surprise, the opposition was able for the first time to take over Aleppo and are now fighting to expand their territory. Many questions remain, and a deliberate propaganda campaign waged by Iran and Russia with the help of their social media proxies has confused many in the Muslim community who have not followed the events over the last 13 years. Now, we hope today to throw some light on a very confusing picture, what seems like a very confusing picture, and to help us, as always, to untangle the political realities, I have back on the show Sami Hamdi, who joins us today from the United States. Sami, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you with us, Sami, and I think there's a lot to cover today. And I think you'll agree with me that there is this unnecessary confusion out there in the public about Syria, whereas Palestine and Gaza is pretty straightforward. Syria, for whatever reason, and we've addressed it before on multiple occasions, has confused large numbers of people. So, Sami, I want to really explore the sort of the broader dimensions to this conflict in turn. But of course, the Syrian rebellion has historically been a very fractured rebellion. But this week we saw a unification with spectacular results. I suppose the first question to ask you is why now? Why did the resistance move at this stage?
I think that there are a few dynamics that led to this explosion, as we've seen taking place in Syria itself, that's caught a lot of the international powers off guard. I think the first thing to note is that Iran, which has been propping up Bashar al-Assad and its militias and the like, have been severely weakened as a result of the events that have been taking place in Gaza, Hezbollah being battered by the Israelis, and also Iran coming under significant pressure in Syria itself, particularly given that they expected their ally Bashar al-Assad to be able to help them and to be able to use Bashar al-Assad. But as a result, we've seen instead that the Iranians have been weakened, and therefore Bashar al-Assad has been weakened. And therefore, there is this sense that we can take advantage of Iran's weakness in order to finally go and make an advance on Bashar al-Assad. The second point that is worth noting is that Russia's engagement in Ukraine is very costly. And although it's making some ground in Ukraine, the reality is that it's not making it as much as it would like. And there has been a sort of transfer of resources towards the Ukrainian front in order to help with Ukraine. And there is this sense, indeed, in Moscow or indeed in Russia itself, that perhaps, or view amongst the resistance at least, that Russia perhaps may not be as engaged as perhaps it was once before. The third point that is worth noting is that there was a sense on the part of the resistance that was in Idlib itself, the idea that given that Bashar al-Assad had taken much territory and given that there was a sense internationally that the conflict was dying down, there was a sense that that view that Assad believed that given there was a rehabilitation of his regime in the Arab world, Mohammed bin Salman received him at Riyadh, UAE talking about investments, and Bashar al-Assad now essentially coming back to the Arab League and being considered one of many. Erdogan in Turkey talking about reconciling with Bashar al-Assad and inviting Bashar al-Assad to Ankara to try to talk with him and to go back to, in Erdogan's words, the days of the past when they were good friends. There was a sense amongst those in Idlib that they were being sold out, that perhaps things were not going according to plan. And indeed, there was an intensity in the bombing of the Russians and this Assad regime around Idlib that intensified over the past 2 months, almost as if there was a consideration on the part of the Russians and Assad that maybe they could make another offensive towards Idlib. The Turks have long complained that although Erdogan is talking about reconciling with Assad, Assad saw in those statements a weakness and therefore an opportunity to go after Idlib itself. I think within this within this wider context, I think the resistance believe that in many ways it's almost now or never, very similar to the Palestinians. Either we move now before the international powers make an agreement to essentially divide Syria and whereby we become mere proxies, or we try to force a new status quo and shake the cards and the like. I do think that although there's much talk about whether Turkey knew or not, I think Turkey knew about a desire to launch an offensive, but perhaps was not keen on the timing of this particular offensive. And there were reports coming out of Ankara that Erdogan was trying to delay the offensive first in order to see whether Assad would talk or not, but that those in Idlib or those that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and these other groups were not willing to wait and decided to embark on their own. And I think that the rapid advance that they made means that Erdogan today is sort of saying, okay, hang on a second, you guys are actually getting into Aleppo, you're actually going towards Hama. At the end of the day, your wins means my position on the negotiating table is stronger. Let's see how far it goes until the Russians really come in and say enough is enough. From the Russian perspective, they're sort of turning, I mean, we'll delve into this later, but the Russians are sort of saying, we wanted a peace agreement in Syria. I want to wrap up Syria to focus on Ukraine. Assad is annoying me by not taking up the offers by Erdogan to come and talk. Maybe there's not much of a tragedy if he loses some territory, if it forces him to come to the negotiating table in and of itself. I think the speed and pace with which they've taken territory has been quite surprising.
Yeah.
But I think those who followed Syria, and this is something that's worth noting, will remember that Jolani, the head of the HTS 2 years ago, actually gave a khutbah or gave a speech in which he told his followers, he told them that we are almost militarily prepared to launch a new offensive. We just need a couple of years. And this was, I think, in 2021 or in 2022. So the idea that this is a surprise, I think it's a surprise for outsiders watching Syria. But I think inside, I think this planning has been embarked on for quite some time. I think that this has been in the works. And I think, to be honest, if you look in hindsight, the very fact that Assad was unable to take Idlib, the very fact that he was unable to take the surrounding territories, the very fact that he was unable to take the northeast of Syria from the separatist Kurds, the SDF or the YPG or these other particular groups, I think that in itself was always an evidence staring us in the face that the Syrian conflict may have been frozen, but it wasn't finished. And all it needed was a new, fresh bound or a shift in the power dynamics to start again. But I think the essence of it is, to be honest, I think that given that Iran has been weakened, its influence has been weakened, its ability to support its militias appear to have been weakened, at least in Lebanon. It's important to remember and bear in mind, this is just analysis. This isn't passing a moral judgment or anything at all. But it is important to note that the reason Assad was able to survive for so long was because of Hezbollah, was because of Lebanon. When the Free Syria Army were marching on Damascus in 2014 or the like, it was Hezbollah that crossed over the border from Lebanon into Syria and broke the back of the Free Syria Army. When another offensive was launched in about 2018, 2019, they managed to get to Saraqib and they managed to take more territory. And then Hezbollah crossed over, entered Saraqib itself. The Turks got a bit nervous about the potential of the offensive. The Turks withdrew their drones and Hezbollah proceeded to massacre the resistance. Hezbollah has been a key component in keeping Assad afloat, in keeping Assad there in position. And therefore, the weakening of Hezbollah and indeed the weakening of Iran, I think lends itself an opportunity for the Syrians to essentially liberate their country from those who've come to occupy it from abroad.
That's a very, very interesting answer. I mean, let's just pick up on the Turkey point that you make there. Of course, the rebellion or the resistance, or however we phrase it, was holed up in Idlib for many years. And it just seems to me that Turkey, of course, was seen in very much as the state that was defending, or at least was celebrating the cause of the rebellion, or at least on an international level, Turkey was responsible for diplomatic efforts to try to reconcile and create a permanent solution for Syrians, and of course over the last few weeks there has been an effort to extend a hand to Assad, who refused to meet with the Turkish delegation except placing down some preconditions to that conversation. I suppose my question here is that how much did Turkey know about this offensive, particularly because the Syrian National Army is a Turkish outfit. I mean, at least it's seen to be a proxy of Turkey. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that. And the Syrian National Army has been quite key to, in particular, the Aleppo campaign, because of course this has been a campaign of a number of groups that have come together. So, can you address the Turkey point for us, please? How central is Turkey to this offensive?
I think no one will ever know for certain. I think what is clear is that when you look at the analysis coming out of Ankara itself and indeed from the Turks, the view is that Turkey did not know about the timing of the offensive, but knew that an offensive was planned.
Mm.
And that Turkey was trying to get the offensive delayed in the hope that Assad would actually start negotiating. And in the case that Assad negotiates, the Turks would say an offensive is not necessary because now we are negotiating a carving up of Syria with the Russians and Assad, and we can create an autonomous region whereby you guys can rule. So there's no need for an offensive instead. And indeed, all the reports suggest that offensive was planned for maybe October or maybe it was planned for the end of the year, but that the groups acted earlier and perhaps didn't tell the Turks otherwise. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Turks were caught by surprise in terms of preparation. I think that it's important to remember that Turkey has been managing relationships between these various different groups. I think that although the HTS and the groups in Idlib are referred to often as proxies of Turkey, I think that's a slightly inaccurate statement, only insofar as while Turkey has the most influence and while Turkey has significant power to be able to impose itself, I think that Turkey's relationship with them has been more of how do I manage the relationships in a way because I cannot order them to do what I want them to do. It's not like the Iranians, which can call Hassan Nasrallah, who died recently, and say, Hassan Nasrallah, I need you to enter Syria and go and defeat Assad. Then Hassan Nasrallah says, Hadr. It's an order from Iran and I mobilize. It's not like Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq where Khamenei can call the Iraqi government and say, I need the militias to cross over into Syria and fight. And they say, Sam'an wa ta'a, we hear and we obey, and they march straight away. I think with the relationship between Turkey and the factions in Idlib itself was more that the factions have an independence that Turkey had to navigate, which is why Turkey had to establish the Syrian National Army. The Syrian National Army, which is the term given, is a group that was composed by Turkey for two reasons. The first is that HTS is still proscribed as a terrorist organization. And therefore, to market Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and HTS and the groups in Idlib, the other 26, 27 different factions, to market them internationally was very difficult for Turkey. To market them in Washington, to market them as an alternative was very difficult internationally so long as Jolani remained the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because of the incident in which he announced an allegiance to Al-Qaeda and then would later break from them and go and defeat them. But the very fact that he declared his allegiance at some point in time, even if it was just for a few months, meant that Erdogan couldn't find a PR narrative to really push successfully in favor of those to support Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and indeed the Syrians who are marching against Assad. So the creation of the Syrian National Army was to create an entity that could be marketed. They called it the Syrian National Army. It's composed of a group that Turkey has hand chosen and hand picked, and that is in essence the SNA is the Turkish proxy. Erdogan orders that unit to move; it moves accordingly, and I think that's why when it comes to Turkey's reaction, Turkey may not have known about the timing of the offensive, or maybe it had suspicions, or maybe it wasn't told. But I think what indicated that Turkey doesn't have a big problem with it is the deployment of the SNA, the deployment of the Syrian National Army. And you'll remember in the first days when they went towards Aleppo, as soon as the Syrian National Army was deployed, it was the clearest indication that Erdogan, at least for now, is willing to entertain this offensive and to see how far it will go. The reason why I'm hesitant to delve too much into whether Turkey knew or not is because the agency of the Syrians sometimes gets lost when we talk about the international powers. It's important to remember that there is agency on the ground, that Syrians do have power. Syrians are able to shake things up, and Syrians are able to engage in action that forces international powers to move and to mobilize itself. And the second reason is if Turkey knew about the offensive, the question is why provoke Russia and why provoke Assad at this time when you're looking for reconciliation? Consider this. Erdogan reconciled with the UAE and agreed to silence UAE opposition and agreed to silence Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and agreed to a number of concessions that he perhaps on another day would not willingly agree on. And UAE gave him 50 billion in exchange. Erdogan reconciled with bin Salman and went to Riyadh to say to bin Salman, please, we are sorry, let's reconcile. And although bin Salman is still giving him the cold shoulder, certainly Erdogan is continuing to push alongside along this reconciliation track. We've seen even with regards to Gaza, Erdogan is not keen to go up against the Israelis. While he's been giving fiery speeches, trade with Israel has continued. Even when he suspended trade, he allowed the loopholes. Even when those loopholes got exposed, still we see that there is sort of a dogged attitude from Erdogan, whereby he wants to balance, in which he tells the Turks that I am standing against the Israelis, while telling the Israelis and the Americans that I want to hold the stick to the middle. I actually want peace because my economic crisis doesn't allow me to embark even further. All indications suggest that Erdogan doesn't want an offensive. Erdogan doesn't want to rock the boat. Erdogan instead just wants to reconcile instead. The only scenario in which Erdogan might have welcomed this offensive, and why I think there is support for it at this moment in time, is it may well be that the Turkish calculation is that the resistance or the rebels, or call them whatever you will not be able to get to Damascus. But if they take Aleppo and they deal a heavy blow in Hama and they get close to Damascus, Assad will be forced to negotiate. Not and Assad won't be able to stop them going to Damascus, but Russia might, and therefore Russia might force Assad into dealing with Turkey, whereby an autonomous region is established in the north that is influenced by Turkey, that is governed predominantly by Turkish-backed factions, and essentially, as we saw with Bahjali, the Erdogan's partner in government, the Turks can expand their borders, by which, and you saw Bahjali say, Halab is Turkish, and the proof is they raised the Turkish flag. There's always been this idea of expanding the map to include Halab and make it belong to Turkey. The irony, of course, being that Syrians don't belong in Turkey, but Halab belongs to Turkey. But in any case, the point here being is, I think that for the Turks, they may not have known about the offensive because of the agency of the Syrians, but I don't think they're necessarily opposed until they see the reaction of Russia and Russia's scorched earth policy. Because the last time the rebels or resistance did this, Russia came in and bombed the living daylights out of their gains, and they were forced back. At this moment, Putin seems to be of the view, as it stands at the moment, of the view that yes, Assad is frustrating. We wanted Assad to talk. We want to round up Syria. Maybe there's a certain red line that will allow them to reach before we decide what to do. Or it could be, bear in mind, this is just analysis, but it could be the other situation, which is that the HTS and the rebel factions have taken everybody by surprise. And Putin is not sure how to react to it. Neither is Assad, neither are the Iranians. And I think everybody's still monitoring how far they can go.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's pick up on HTS now. For some time, I think there's been some unease about the nature of HTS. HTS have gone through a number of iterations. Historically, they were linked to Al Qaeda. They were called the Nusra Front, and they changed their name to HTS to reflect a more nation-based organization rather than an international so-called jihadist organization in inverted commas, right? So I suppose the question really for you is has this moderation, and again in inverted commas, has it really been genuine? Is there a genuine moderation of this group? And what are the signs of that moderation? Because of course, in the early days, when I was following the events quite intently, it was very clear to me that HTS in Idlib, when they set up the nascent government, was extremely authoritarian and did not tolerate dissent very easily. What are the signs that analysts suggest that this group is now moderated?
I think that when it comes to the issue of announcing their allegiance to Al Qaeda, it's also important to remember that it's HTS that wiped out Al Qaeda and also went to fight ISIS too. The reason Al Qaeda doesn't exist is because Jolani flipped on them and essentially destroyed them and ruined them. The second point that is worth noting is that Idlib, a lot of the Syrians that were shipped out of the southern territories by the Iranians and replaced instead by Shia that the Iranians brought in to occupy their homes as they kicked Sunnah out of those homes. I think it's important to remember that Idlib is very diverse and the factions are very diverse. And I think that it is a testament, and this is just analysis, it's not praise or a moral judgment or the like. I think that is a testament to the way Idlib has survived in the manner that the managing of those factions has been conducted in a way in which now under HTS, you have a whole broad range of factions, to the extent that when they entered Aleppo, you had the Druze, you had the Christians, you had Armenians, you had these others welcoming them. And you had a lot of engagement on the part of HTS and indeed the groups that entered Aleppo, in which they indicated that no Christian will be harmed, no church is to be harmed. And we've all seen the videos of people coming in and saying that their days are continuing unabated without any harassment from those particular troops. The reason why I'm wary of using the words moderate and extreme in this particular cases is because when people are using the word moderate, they are suggesting that some Islamic values have been abandoned, and as a result, they're now becoming more moderate and more acceptable. The protection of religious minorities is an Islamic value. The guarantee of their security is an Islamic value. The guarantee of their safety is an Islamic value. The reassurance of minorities is an Islamic value because it stems from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he gave his orders after Badr that you may not cut down trees, you may not kill women, and you may not kill the innocent. And it comes from that tradition first and foremost. I'm reminded a little bit of when Izzet Begovic was asked that why is it the Serbs believe in an Orthodox Serbian state, the Croats believe in their own Croat state, but you insist that we can all live together. How do you hold on to these European values in the midst of the fire? And he said, these aren't European values. European values is the Holocaust. It's massacres after the Crusades. It's slaughtering of local populations when they enter. It's my Islamic values that assure me that we can all live together. So I'm very worried that when we use the word moderate, the implication is that there is an abandonment of some Islamic values. Not that I'm saying Al Qaeda represent any of them, but what I'm saying is I think that these groups that are entering in, that are predominantly Islamists, are displaying some of these Islamic values insofar as the treatment of local civilians or the like. And we're seeing these heartwarming videos of families coming together. This is not an endorsement of HTS. We all saw Bilal Abdikarim's documentaries. We all saw some of the other journalists from inside Idlib itself that talked about some of the authoritarian crackdowns, that talked about some of the torture that has been taking place. But as far as what we've seen so far in Aleppo and Hama, at least from the reports that are coming out, it does appear that at this moment in time, the social fabric appears to be maintained so far, according to the reports that are coming out, by the testament of the minorities themselves, which does suggest an evolution in thinking and governance on the part of Jolani and on the part of the HTS itself. I think also what's worth noting is that people are calling this a liberation. Syrians are calling this a liberation. I know some people are calling it, a terrorist and a rebel and the like. But I think that when you look at Syrians who are celebrating, like the secular Burhan Ghalioun, who's coming out and using the words liberation, he was part of the original opposition that, when in 2011, 2012. When you see other Syrians coming out with no affiliation to HTS, no affiliation to Jolani, coming out and calling this a liberation, Syrians are not naive. They are not celebrating the groups. They are celebrating the liberation of the cities from Bashar al-Assad and the return of agency from Assad and from the international powers to their own hands in and of themselves. And I think that when you see today that Jolani's number 2 or number 3 issues a statement, or HTS, that Alawis, in talking to the Alawites themselves, Alawites, abandon Assad and come back. There will be no repercussions. When you see them issue statements that those who fought in the Syria army will receive a full pardon. I'm not saying it's similar to when the Taliban came out and everybody expected reprisals and then was shocked when there were no reprisals when the Taliban came in. Again, this is not a praise of the Taliban, but rather what we're saying is the Taliban said it and then didn't conduct any reprisals. Therefore, this time it just suggests there is an evolution. Taliban in 1996, they entered Kabul and executed the president in the middle of the square and proceeded to commit massacres and to commit killings. When they entered Kabul the second time, they learned their lesson from the first time. And indications suggest maybe that Jolani has learned his lesson on this particular occasion. Having said that, it is worth noting that these are early days and news is changing every single minute. While they've taken Aleppo and Hama, we still haven't seen what the Russian reaction is. We've seen some bombing in Idlib. We've seen some military exercises in Tartus next to the Mediterranean Sea by Russian troops. We've seen news and videos of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the Iraqi, pro-Iran Iraqi militias in Iraq, sending videos saying, prepare, we might cross over into Syria to go and rescue Bashar al-Assad. We've seen the Iranian foreign minister say that if Syria asks, we will send troops to Syria. These are early days. The shock of taking Aleppo and Hama, it seems that we've yet to see the full reaction of the Iranians and the Russians and the extent to which Assad is collapsing and the extent to which Russia is willing to let Assad collapse. And that's why I think the euphoria of the early days, insofar as there is a liberation of the cities, should be tempered with the sober nature of history, in that, as we saw with, in Palestine, that taking land from Greater Israel was met with genocide afterwards. I'm not saying this will happen in Syria. What I'm saying is, as far as it stands, this is certainly a game changer. It's certainly flipped the dynamics. It's certainly thrown the cards up in the air, but it's unclear how those cards will fall.
Should we also moderate our expectations when it comes to just the nature of these groups and the way they act towards one another? Now, of course, at the moment, there is a unity of purpose between the groups, and the groups are remarkably, actually, they've come together and they're fighting together. But we know from past experience, these groups fall out with one another, and they have acted like warlords when they have taken territory in the past. I mean, how confident are you that the groups have learned that lesson of division and of petty territorial disputes, and are now ready to give that up for a greater purpose?
I think there are two things to note here. The first is that fitna is not caused by those who resist it. Fitna is caused by the one who committed it. And I think that everybody is saying, many people argue that Assad should stay because the alternative is the scenario that you painted:
Mm.
warlords fighting each other, Israel benefiting, America benefiting, all these things as well. The suggestion is that anybody who stands against Bashar al Assad is inevitably standing against Syria and benefiting the enemy. But my problem with that argument is that the reality is the opposite. Assad's oppression and Assad's dhulm is what tore Syria apart. Assad's oppression is what gave room for Israelis to navigate, gave room for the Americans to interfere, gave room for the Russians to bomb Syria into oblivion, gave room for Turkish nationalists to talk about taking Halab and putting it part of Turkey itself, gave room for the Iranians to come in and send those militia itself. Ibn Khaldun's maxim is الظلم مؤذن بخراب العمران. He says العدل أساس الملك والظلم مؤذن بخراب العمران. Justice is the foundation of a stable state, and oppression is what destroys civilization. Oppression destroys the state. We have in Islamic literature, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, the Khalifa, was sent a letter by one of his governors who said to him, Jalal, similar to you, that I need more forces. I need you to send me more armies because there are tribes here that keep fighting each other and tribes here that are causing disturbances. I need you to send me a force to help me to go and crush them and keep the peace and to fortify the area. And Umar Abdul Aziz responds to him and says to him, it's not armies you need. Hassanha bil adl, fortify it with justice. And that's why I argue that it's true that, when we look at, for example, the potential scenarios that could emerge, maybe warlords end up fighting each other or the like. But I don't think the fault would be those of the warlords as much as it would be the fault of Assad, who led his country into an oppressive state that meant that people would go to extreme lengths in order to get rid of him. Assad could have just left. His family been in power for so many decades, two rulers over the past 50 years. He could have left and said, I'm not the right person to govern Syria, and let somebody else come in. But he chose not to. And he rebelled against the Syrian people's desire for freedom and the like. And therefore, I don't think necessarily that the onus of fitna should be flipped. The second point that is worth noting is to put things into the wider context. And perhaps this is a bit difficult for me to say, given that I come from an Algerian heritage. But the Algerian groups, they fought against the French. Once the French were kicked out, they started infighting between themselves.
Yeah.
Belqasim Karim executed in Frankfurt, Boumediene toppling Ben Bella going rogue in terms of some of his policies or the like. But even in the midst of that, of those issues between them, the French could not come back. The French could not colonize Algeria. The French were gone. The chapter of colonization finished. A new chapter came in which it came about national reconciliation. And that's why I argue that if your scenario emerges, and it would be a devastating, unfortunate scenario, I don't think it would be a retreat backwards. It would be the opening of a chapter forwards. The oppression ripped the country apart by Bashar al-Assad. We got rid of the oppression of Bashar al-Assad. Now, how do we build a new social contract and a new state between us? And that could emerge either through warlords, it could emerge through a national dialogue, it could emerge through the Syrians agreeing between themselves and restricting it. Dynamics could be different in Syria. Not every country is the same in terms of its dynamics in and of itself. But I think that when you look at the groups at this moment in time, it is true they are united against Bashar al-Assad. It's unclear what their governance will look like. There are reports that they're discussing what governance could look like. There's reports that HTS could even be disbanded, or it could be rebranded, or that a constitution could be drawn that discusses how power might be divided between themselves. That all of these discussions will be left to the Syrians, and they have every right to decide how they want to be governed, with some help from the Ummah, of course, because the liberation of Syria affects the liberation of Gaza itself. But the short answer to your question is, I don't know what the next scenario could look like. And I admit that it could look like in which the factions defeat Assad and then fight between themselves, which has been common in history in and of itself. But history also shows that that chapter is always a chapter that comes after the destruction of an oppressive state, not before, not as a substitute to an oppressive state. And that's why I argue that at the end of the day, it may well be that these rebel groups will go back to infighting, or it may well be that they take Damascus and the people force them into a concession, because we also have examples like Suwar al-Dhahab in Sudan, who did a coup in 1984 against Ja'far al-Numeri. He ruled in 1985, and in the end of 1985, he comes out himself under no obligation and says to Sudanese people, I'm handing power back. Hold your elections. And it led to the Sadiq al-Mahdi winning the government and coming into power again. Suwar al-Dhahab goes down in history as one of the only generals who turned around and said, I don't want to rule. I did it to keep the peace. I didn't want the country to be divided. I've kept it here for a year. I want to hand it back, and I give it back to you. And Suwar al-Dhahab, his history now is in Dhahab. Dhahab meaning gold. His surname is gold. His history now is laden with gold. So anything can happen. I think that's why a lot of it depends on how we talk about Syria and the vision that we present for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some interesting strands that come out of your answer there. I mean, you've heard some sheikhs and imams in America, but as well as imams here in the UK, who argue that Assad is a bad guy and he's a tyrant, but the ultimate solution, the ultimate end to all of this revolting is going to be a Libya mess, where you had a lot of hope put into this anti-Gaddafi rebellion, but it turned now Libya into a failed state. It's not even a state with a strong central government. It's a state that is governed by warlords and gangs and criminality seems to be the way by which the space is filled. Is there an alternative to that? Like, the Arab Spring hasn't yet given us a coherent state that is run by the people. Can we really see that arising in Syria?
I think the first thing to note is you refer to some mashayikh in America who talk about Assad may be bad, but it's better than the alternative. And I think that the premise of that assertion is wrong because it suggests that the Syrians had a choice, or that Libyans had a choice, or that Tunisians had a choice. I think that when you live in such oppression, when you live in such dhulm, I think eventually it gets to a stage where things explode. And that's a maxim, by the way. That's a rule. It's not a suggestion. History shows it's a rule, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows it's a rule. And Ibn Taymiyyah famously said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give victory to a just state, even if it is kafira, even if it doesn't believe in him, but will destroy, yahlik, will destroy a Muslim state that is unjust. For Allah can tolerate justice with kufr, but will not will not tolerate injustice with Islam. The point here being is that it's a maxim. All the scholars have agreed upon it. Modern day scholars cannot come and usurp what has been established for hundreds and hundreds of years with regards to the role of justice and the role of oppression destroying the state. What I'm saying is, once you have oppression, the fall of the state is inevitable, not because of those who rise up against the state, because of the act of oppression that was unchecked. And the reason it was unchecked is because scholars said we shouldn't talk openly against the ruler. It's because scholars said let the ruler do what he needs to do because he knows better than you. And oppression ran rampant until we normalized the idea that the ruler can do what he wants and get away with it. Which is why when the Syrians told Bashar al-Assad, we want freedom, we want dignity, we want the bugs from the walls to be taken off, we want to live in dignity and freedom, Bashar al-Assad was so normalized to the idea of getting what he wants. He told them to hell with all of you, and he mobilized the forces against them in order to massacre them or the like. That doesn't neglect the fact, as some people argue, that Israel or the US or the like perhaps want to see a dismantling of the Syrian state. It is possible for two things to be true without undermining the Syrian revolution or indeed what the Syrians want themselves. Primarily because I think when it comes to the Israelis, I think after the 1967 war and 1973, they went after three armies. The belief was we need to dismantle three Muslim armies. The first was Egypt, second is Iraq, and third is Syria. Egypt, the Americans went in, established good ties, and now they are the ones giving money to the Egyptian army, and the Egyptian guns turned from pointing towards the Israelis to pointing towards the Egyptian people itself, and it's focused solely on containing the Egyptian people and preventing them from asserting any self-determination. Iraq, we saw with the invasion of Saddam Hussein, they went and invaded Iraq. Whatever you might think of Saddam, the reality is that at the end of the day, although Saddam was believed to be the Eastern Wall against the Iranians and seen to be an Arab nationalist leader, it's undeniable that without his oppression, Americans don't go into Iraq. If he had justice in Iraq, I don't think Iraqis would have entertained the idea of allowing the Americans to come in, because the Americans were able to enter Iraq with the support of Iraqis inside Iraq itself. And many Iraqi collaborators worked with the Americans, who were then propped up by the Americans in the government themselves. I don't think that happens if you have a state of justice. And like in Syria, it is true that Israel and the Americans want to see Syria dismantled. They want to see Syria in chaos. They want to see Syria brought down. But that's a half truth. The other 50% of the truth that makes up the whole truth, like when Allah says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَأَنْتُمْ سُكَارَى. If you stop the ayah, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةَ, do not approach salah, you would think you don't go to pray. You have to finish the ayah, وَأَنْتُمْ سُكَارَى. And when you're intoxicated, do not approach prayer when intoxicated. When people argue Israel and America, they're saying, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةَ. Do not approach prayer. Do not approach, nahy anil munkar, forbidding what is evil. Do not approach, amr bil ma'ruf. Finish it with, the reality is Israel and America do not have leverage or power in Syria without the injustice that Assad imposes in Syria, that creates an environment for them to come in. And I think a recent proof of that is when you look at Erdogan in 2016. Erdogan, when the army tried to topple him in a coup, who came out onto the streets in order to prevent the army from committing the coup? It was the people. Obama came out and said, we are monitoring the situation, meaning we're hoping Erdogan falls. The UAE were reporting that Erdogan had fled to Germany. Saudi was celebrating, saying Erdogan has fled to Russia. We saw all these international powers so desperately keen to see Erdogan fall. Who kept Erdogan in power? It was the Turkish people. Why? Because Erdogan built the roads for them. He built the hospitals. He built the airports. He developed those cities in the south. He developed those cities in the east. You'll remember in the last election, a woman said, remember 20 years ago how long it took an ambulance to get to this area? It took an hour and a half. Under Erdogan, it takes 15 minutes. People were able to see what Erdogan was implementing on, even when the earthquakes in eastern Turkey, and this is not me celebrating Erdogan, this is me making an observation. When the earthquakes took place in eastern Turkey and devastated the area, there was a poll done in Turkey. Who do you blame for the destruction? They said Erdogan. Who do you trust to rebuild it? They said Erdogan. Because he established a relationship with the Turkish people whereby the guy doesn't just talk, he builds, and people see that building and people see that difference. Israel and America do not have power in Egypt, Syria, or Iraq without the oppression of the leaders and that they impose on their people themselves, that makes people disillusioned and unwilling to defend the government or the entity that they have. And note that when Abu Sufyan sent somebody to go to the Sahaba, to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wanted to find, how do people react to him? Are there any cracks he could exploit? Is there any disgruntlement he could exploit? And when the messenger that he sent came back, he said, when you see the way they treat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you can pay them the whole world, they will not abandon him. He was saying, we can't convince any of them to abandon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even though their material conditions are inferior to Quraysh's material conditions. We're talking about people who are living in what we would term today poverty, but still they will not abandon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam because of his justice. And that's why Ibn Khaldun said, Al-Adlu Assasul Mulk, justice is the foundation of dominion. That's why Ibn Taymiyyah said Allah will always preserve justice, regardless whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim. This is the essence of it. So I agree that the Israelis, when they're watching what's happening in Assad, they're sort of saying, we don't mind Assad losing some of the territory. But that's different from saying that the Israelis support the rebel movement. I think if the rebels take Damascus, Israel will panic. The ideal situation for Israel is that neither Assad is strong nor the rebels are strong. The ideal situation for the Americans is that Assad is weak in Damascus and the rebels don't take Damascus, that it remains divided and the like. And that's why I argue, this is why I go back to what I said initially. What Israel and America wants has no bearing on the moral legitimacy of what the Syrians want, because the reality is that these powers are not omnipotent. They get taken by surprise, just as they were in the Arab Spring in Tunisia, just as they were in the Arab Spring in Egypt, or the like. The final point worth mentioning, you said there's no real model in the Arab Spring, where we can look to and say that it has been a success. But that's not because of the international powers. A lot of that is because of the domestic powers in and of themselves. The Islamists in Tunisia and Nahda, they had power for 2 years. They did not build a single hospital in the country. They did not go and impose, they did not focus on the poor. They told them, wait and be patient. They bailed out the big banks that were giving loans to the corrupt businessmen and told the poor that we have no money to help you. They went to the tourism and bailed them out after the terrorist attack in Susa. They bailed those tourism companies out in the coastal regions and neglected the inner regions. They passed the Financial Reconciliation Act that forgave the financial crimes in the Bin Ali era because they didn't want investors to run away, and then told the poor, we have no money for unemployment benefits and no money for healthcare. It wasn't international powers. People gave them a mandate and gave them hope, and they failed miserably. I think that when you look in Libya itself, that after Tripoli, yes, you had all those militias, but after Libya itself, those militias could not agree between themselves. It wasn't about international powers. Everyone wanted to be king. No one cared about Libya itself. And even when you had the 2014 elections, Libyans were so disillusioned by these militias and so disillusioned by those who came and were delivered by the revolution that they had voted for. They were so disillusioned, they didn't go and vote in 2014. Only 20% went to go and vote in the elections. And that's what Haftar used as a mandate in order to go out and say, I'm going to go and launch a war instead. What made the people lose hope? It was not the international powers. It was the failure of the people there to take advantage, to deliver on the promise of the revolution itself. Because here is my opinion. And again, everyone's a genius on the bench and everyone's a genius when you look in hindsight itself. I argue in Tunisia, where did the revolution begin? Sidi Bouzid, which is where my father's hometown is, my ancestral village of Al Hawamid, Sidi Bouzid. If it started in Sidi Bouzid and then went to Qasrin and then Gafsa and then Qayrawan and then it went south, then it goes to the coastal areas. Jalal, me and you are policy advisors. Where do you start with the development? Who do you appease first? Who do you go immediately to try to provide some sort of tangible development? The same way Erdogan did in eastern Turkey. Where do you go first to appease? Do you go to Susa in the coast or do you go to Sidi Bouzid where it began? Do you go to Tunis, the capital, in Marsa, and you provide them the benefit? Or do you go to Gafsa and Qasrim and you build for them the infrastructure to make them feel like they got something from the revolution? You don't tell the poor to wait and appease the rich to keep them in the country. You do the opposite way around. And that's why I argue that you cannot talk about the Arab Spring as an international conspiracy. I was in Tunisia for the most part of 10 years. I can tell you it was not UAE or Qatar who convinced the Tunisian that they want to get on a boat and risk their lives to go to Europe on those death boats. It was a Tunisian, when you sit with him in the cafe, he tells you that I did the revolution. I was on the streets. I'm the one who put my body in front of the police. And now when the government talks in Tunis, they talk about only bailing out the rich. They don't talk about the poor. And that's why I think the Seerah is a majestic book of politics. What does the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam emphasize more than anything else? He emphasizes that you lift the poor, that you support, give social welfare, that you benefit the weakest of society so that they have a stake. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq established the mantra when he became Khalifa, when he said, the strong amongst you are weak in my eyes until I take the rights of others from you, and the poor amongst you are strong in my eyes until I take the rights and hand them to you. The point being, what's Abu Bakr saying is the purpose of the state is to focus on Sidi Bouzid, not to focus on Tunis, the capital. So when you say, we saw, and it will be a mess and it will be, etc., the ones who decide whether it will be a mess in the aftermath are not America. It's not Turkey. It's not Russia. It's not, let's not deny agency to our ummah. Let's not deny agency to our people. It will be those in Syria and the priorities and how they agree on developing infrastructure and providing for the Syrian people. Because the reason people in 2016 came out for Erdogan was not because of Erdogan himself. It wasn't about his character or his personality. It was this guy provided for us. We've seen the tangible benefits. We don't want to go back to a time when you guys failed. So I think that that myth of the Arab Spring, we still talk about it through Western lens without realizing. We still talk about it in Orientalist language without realizing we have yet to compile research indigenously from the Ummah itself on what actually happened in the Arab Spring. And I argue when you do that, you will find that it had far more to do with internal dynamics than external dynamics, because Allah always gives agency to the Ummah, and it's always the Ummah whether it decides to use it or whether it decides not to.
Can I pick up on a point you made there about the American policy towards Syria? Now, it did seem to me that throughout the early days of the revolution, in particular under the Obama government, there was a policy or a strategy of keeping the revolution in balance with the government. And the idea was that Syria will remain weak, but at the same time, no one party would be able to win a decisive win over this. And so Obama turned a blind eye possibly to Russia's inclusion into the conflict, and certainly did not punish Iran. In fact, rewarded Iran with a nuclear deal, even though it had committed horrific crimes in Syria, because of course Iran thwarted in many respects the revolution. Is that policy, does that policy still remain today? And what of the conversation that some are having on the fringes that the ultimate American plan is to balkanize Syria into free entities? We'll come to the Kurdish entity in a bit, but to balkanize Syria into free entities. I mean, how valid do you think that conversation is?
U.S. policy in the Arab Spring was very simple. They were taken by surprise by Bouazizi and the people of Sidi Bouzid and then the people of Tunisians who took to the streets. And they were taken by surprise that Ben Ali was toppled so quickly. They were taken by surprise that Mubarak was toppled in Egypt. And after Mubarak was toppled in Egypt, the Americans said, hang on a second, something serious is happening here. Our allies are falling. Initially, the American policy was, let's see what comes next. When the elections took place, Islamists won. People didn't vote for Islamists, they voted for Islam. They perceived the Islamists to be associated with Islam and then abandoned the Islamists in Tunisia, at least, when they felt that they weren't necessarily very much connected with Islam or the like. But in any case, when the election results came out, there was deep concern in the US in that, okay, we're talking about democracy, but if it's producing these results, I'm not sure we want it. We're talking about democracy. We've been investing heavily in secularization. Tunis has been under secularization for 60 years. Brutal secularization, banning of the hijab, Bourguiba drinking orange juice in the 1973, 1972. I might have the year wrong, but in 1970s, he came on TV during Ramadan, drank orange juice during the day and said, I'm giving you a fatwa that because fasting affects the productivity of the economy and we have an economic crisis, there is darura, a necessity for you guys not to fast during Ramadan and to continue working. We saw, for example, the crackdown on those who would pray Fajr in the masajid, rabid secularization. If you go to Tunisia, you see, Bikini Beach, you see the nightclubs, you see, etc. The Americans believe that as a result of this secularization, that when democracy comes, who will Tunisians vote for? Secularists. So the Americans were suddenly blown away by the fact that first place comes Nahda with about 30-something% of the vote. Then you have Arida Sha'biya, which is the party that my father ran with and got third place. So almost 50% of the vote, or 50% of the vote, is going towards anybody who says Islam should be the main influence over the state. So the Americans said, hang on a second, we've been socially engineering, funding all these secularization programs, providing all these scholarships for them to come to America and see what civilization looks like. And after 60 years of doing this, these people are still voting for La ilaha illallah, or what they perceive to be La ilaha illallah. I remember being in Egypt. I've told this story before, but there's no harm in saying it again. When 2013, when I went the month before Morsi was elected, you go to an Egyptian guy, for example, in Suhag, Ya Amal Hag, who will you vote for? Or I'm going to go vote for Morsi. Why? عايزين واحد يخاف ربنا. We want somebody who fears Allah. And you look at him in that Western way, a bit, but what about his policies? What's he going to build? What's about his policies do you like? And the guy looks at me and goes, I have no idea what his policies are. But عايزين واحد يخاف ربنا. ما دام يخاف ربنا, ربنا حيفتح عليه. If he fears Allah, Allah will open the doors for him. The Americans, when they saw how democracy played out in the region, they said, hang on a second, we're not sure we like this anymore. And anyone who's read the article, The Dark Prince of the Middle East, by Mohammed bin Zayed, it's a report of bin Zayed's conversations, UAE's president, with Jake Sullivan and US administrators. Bin Zayed says to the Americans, you guys are naive. You don't realize you keep criticizing us autocrats and saying we need democracy. Look what democracy is producing. Do you really want these people, these population in the Arab world who believe a 1400-year-old book should be a constitution, referring to the Quran? Do you believe that these people should be allowed to vote? You want these people to choose their leaders? He said, bin Zayed tells them in the article, he tells Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor supporting the genocide today, he tells him that if a Mahdi, if somebody appeared in Mecca and said, I am the Mahdi, 80% of my army would immediately go to join him. That's the extent to which these people have an affinity for this. So when the Americans saw this, Americans said, it happened in Tunisia, I didn't like it. It happened in Egypt, I didn't like it. I'm intervening in Libya to make sure it doesn't happen. And in Syria, Obama's position essentially was, I brought NATO into Libya, it got into oblivion. And if I allow democracy, Islamists might win again. So I don't want the opposition to win until I'm satisfied with how the opposition look like. So they started elevating random people with no social weighting. Some from the Christians, some from the Muslims, some from the Kurds, some whatever. It was composed of people who had no social weighting, but their ideologies, with the help of the Americans, could be imposed on the Syrians. The inability of Obama to find an opposition group that he would ideologically be comfortable with, meant that he never gave full support to the opposition against Assad. And the American policy became such that we would prefer a weakened Assad in Damascus than a freely elected government in Syria. We would prefer a dictatorship of Assad than the Syrians choosing who their leaders are because they might choose incorrectly. And add on top of that the internal Gulf feud between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, Qatar getting excited, trying to push Ikhwan, Saudi, UAE lobbying against Ikhwan and then declaring them terrorist organization. The opposition essentially fell apart. And Obama essentially shrugged his shoulders and he said, Syria is way too complicated. I don't want the rebels to win. Don't give them weapons. And Saudi stopped giving them weapons. Qatar stopped giving them weapons. I will not allow anyone to give them weapons. And Assad, I'll put sanctions on him and I'll see what happens and see who essentially gives me the best deal before I decide what the American policy should be. When Trump came to power, Trump said, why are we in Syria? We clearly have no interest or no benefit there whatsoever. And the advisors that he had told him, no, we need to stay there. And now Erdogan is saying to the Americans, Trump, why don't you leave? I know you want to leave. You want to tell the Americans that you solved the war, and we Turks will take your position in Syria. We will be your proxy through which you are able to influence Syria. The same way he offered Biden in Afghanistan when Afghanistan was liberated from the occupation. Erdogan told Biden that I can take control of the airport for you and prevent it going to the Taliban. I can be the proxy through which you are able to still have a foot in Afghanistan itself. Whether Erdogan intends to be a proxy or not is irrelevant. But this was the offer that he made. So American policy is, I don't want the revolution to win because it might produce Islam. I don't want that. I'd rather a dictatorship than anything that resembles Islam. But I don't want Assad to win because he's too close to the Iranians. So this stalemate works in my favor. But I think that now with the new administration, it's unclear what the US policy will be. Why? Because whereas Obama in Iraq, when he didn't have a clear idea who he wanted in power or the Americans, what they did was they bolstered the Kurds in the north by promising them independence, and they made them like a check on the central government. They denied them independence because then they would lose influence in Baghdad, but they gave them autonomy so that they would have influence in Baghdad. So the US played a nasty game with the Kurds in which they said, we'll give you a semi-independent state, but not full independence because we need you as a tool to prevent anything in Baghdad happening that we don't like. And they started negotiating with the Iranians after that. In Syria, I think they want the same thing. Let's have a weakened Assad in Damascus, a weakened one. And then let's have an autonomous Kurdish area that can influence Damascus. And let's make sure that the rebels are strong enough to antagonize Assad to prevent him being strong, but not strong enough to take over because they might actually liberate Syria. And if they liberate Syria, Israel is in a very serious crisis.
Now, let me ask you about the SDF forces, the Kurdish forces, because you've touched on that in your last answer. We have got the northeast. In the northeast, you've got the Kurdish forces who played a very horrible role, actually, a very pro-American role in fighting ISIS, and actually they committed some very appalling crimes against civilians during that struggle with ISIS. There was speculation that the Assad government, in effect, allowed that to happen, and there was a relationship between the Assad government and the Kurds. How strong do you feel that relationship with America still is, since Donald Trump did release troops, did remove troops from the Northeast region, if you remember, and I think it was General Mattis who resigned, or was it Kelly who resigned over that? So is there a strong relationship still between the Kurds of the SDF forces and America? And of course, Turkey sees the SDF forces, which essentially are made up of the PKK, they've been fighting an insurgency in Turkey. They see them as an existential threat to Turkey. So explain the role of the Kurds in going forward in all of this and their relationship with the states.
I think first and foremost, it's important that we push back against the premise, and I know you didn't intend this, but an audience might hear it, that we don't necessarily refer to them as the Kurds, because when you say that, it adopts the Ataturk definition of it, which is that Kurds are against Turkey. If you actually look at when the Ottoman Empire fell, the first group to actually fight Ataturk, not for an independent state, but to restore Islam, were the Kurdish population.
Good.
And that's why Ataturk painted them as an existential threat. It's not because they wanted an independent state, it's because they wanted Islam. And then when Ataturk battered Islam amongst the Kurds, believing that that would make them more amenable, these leftist Marxist Kurds emerged, a minority of the Kurdish population, and they are the ones who will make up the SDF, they make up the PKK, they make up the YPG, and they don't enjoy Kurdish support. The reality is that I mean, I remember I spent a lot of time in Van, Diyarbakir. I actually did my honeymoon in Van, which is one of the main Kurdish cities in the eastern Turkey. And my wife told me, "Why are we going to Van of all places?" I said, "When you see, you love it." But in any case, when you actually go to the Kurdish populations, the reason a lot of them voted for Erdogan in the early days was because Erdogan was the first Turkish leader, at least to remain at length in power, because Erbakan was toppled and so was Menderes. But Erdogan was the first to stay in power for a while, to talk with a Muslim identity, and the Kurds bought into that Muslim identity, which is why AK Party did so well. When Erdogan shifted towards more nationalist rhetoric and more nationalist language, that's when the Kurds abandoned him and went more towards other Kurdish parties in and of themselves. Kurds primarily have an Islamic affinity. They primarily resonate with Islam, and the minority Marxist leftists are composed the SDF, and they compose those Kurdish groups that we refer to fighting in Syria. That's important to make a clarification in the beginning, in and of itself. Of course, the irony being that these leftist communist Kurds are supported by the US, which hates communism. But in politics, anything can happen. In any case, the reality is that the Americans wanted to copy the Iraq model. We have the Kurds that keep Baghdad in check. We don't want Assad to fall, but we can't influence Assad. We don't want the rebels to win because they're too Islamist, or they'll liberate the Syrian population. Syrians are Muslims. They'll probably go towards some sort of Islamic idea or the like. Let's do what we did in Iraq. The Kurds want independence. Let's tease them with independence and support them. And then we can give them an autonomous region by which we can antagonize Damascus. The leftist Kurds, the PKK, YPG, and the SDF, they're aware that the Americans are playing them with regards to independence. But their gamble is that given they're giving us so much weapons, we can eventually impose ourselves on the Americans a status quo whereby they will not be able to reverse it, which is what they tried to do in Iraq when they unilaterally declared independence. And then Obama abandoned them and allowed Baghdad to march with Iranian militias. Obama teamed up with the Iranians. And this is the fear about Syria. America teamed up with Iran to rescue Baghdad, to rescue from the Kurdish independence that was being declared by Barzani in North. And that's why people are saying that the Americans are worried about the Iranians in Syria. They're not worried about the Iranians in Syria. America, there is a scenario in Syria where the Americans and the Iranians agreed to rescue Assad. There is a scenario that is unfolding before us where bin Salman, bin Zayed, Iran, and Trump all agreed to rescue Bashar al-Assad because they do not want a scenario in the region whereby the people topple Bashar al-Assad. But going back to the SDF was supported by the Americans, not because the Americans wanted them to have independence, but because given the absence of leverage over the opposition and their dislike for the opposition, given their absence of leverage over Assad and their dislike of Assad, let's have a third entity in the northeast where the oil is, where a lot of the oil is, and then let's use that force there to keep that out of Assad's control. What that meant is that those separatist Kurdish groups, those leftist Marxist groups, meant that when Assad was fighting the rebel groups and the rebel groups were making gains in that northeast Syria, those separatist Kurds would ally with Assad against the rebel groups. And when the rebel groups would go and fight, when Assad would go and fight the rebel groups and they'd be making great advances, sometimes there would be some antagonism from those separatist Kurdish groups towards Bashar al-Assad. It's a flip-flop dynamic that takes place to pursue the aim of some sort of autonomous region. And the reason that Turkey set up the Syrian National Army was not just for a PR campaign. I forgot to mention the second point. The second point is that Erdogan realized the Americans are giving way too many weapons to these separatist Kurdish groups. The Americans were telling the Turks that we promise you we will not let them have independence. We just want them as a tool to use against Damascus. And Erdogan would say, I believe you, but I don't think you realize that the more power you give them, a scenario will come where you can't control them. They will impose a scenario on you, and I don't trust you to rectify that when they decide to act unilaterally. So I want to nip it in the bud. So Erdogan and US actually understand each other. They understand each other's concerns. But the Americans are giving a promise that Erdogan doesn't believe. So Erdogan set up the Syrian National Army to crush those separatist Kurdish groups. Because if they establish an autonomous state that will share a border with Turkey, then they will be able to supply weapons to separatists in Turkey itself and plunge Turkey into a civil war. As it stands at the moment, it does appear that there is deep concern amongst those separatist Kurdish groups with the advance of the rebel movement. Why? Because they have some territory in the outskirts of Aleppo and some of these areas. And now that these rebel groups are going in, they want to control all of those areas. And what HTS have done really well, again, analysis, not a moral judgment or not support or the like. What HTS have done well is they've sent Muslim Kurds from their own organizations, Muslim Kurds from Idlib, Muslim Kurds who fled the Kurdish Marxist separatists, Muslim Kurds who fled, who aren't for an independent Kurdish state, but are for a more Ummadic state that respects Islam. He sent those Muslim Kurds to reassure the Kurdish population that HTS is not coming to take revenge. And that has upset the Marxist Kurds in the same way that the PKK in Turkey hated Erdogan because Erdogan's Muslim rhetoric was making Kurds in eastern Turkey go towards AK Party, not towards separatist PKK language or the like, which is one of the reasons the PKK, scuppered the peace talks in 2013 when they refused to demilitarize, despite Öcalan promising previously that he would do so. But in any case, I think that with those separatist Kurdish movements, the Americans want to use them as a proxy, but their fear is for them under Trump. This fear doesn't exist under Biden. It doesn't exist under Democrats. It only exists under Trump. Their fear is Trump might actually come to an agreement with Erdogan, whereby he unilaterally withdraws from Syria and lets Erdogan as a NATO ally send his troops there. And Erdogan will crush those Kurdish separatists. Because Trump, if you remember, and you mentioned it, it's a very good point. And I said this in the last podcast when we were talking about John Bolton, that John Bolton wanted war, Trump sacked him. The John Kelly and then Mattis or these people, Trump wanted to withdraw, they wanted to stay. And I think it's Kelly. Kelly is the one who ended up resigning as a result.
Yeah.
Trump doesn't want what the warmongers want in America. I'm not endorsing Trump, by the way. I'm saying what we saw in Syria. Trump may well say, I couldn't give a damn about the separatist Kurds. I don't give a damn about these dynamics. I care about MAGA and my supporters here, and I want to tell them that what Biden broke, I fixed. What Democrats broke, I fixed. I'm stopping wars and I'm bringing our troops home. I'm making a deal over Ukraine with the Russians. I'm dealing with Syria. I'm bringing those troops home. And don't worry, Erdogan is going to look after Syria for us because he's a NATO ally and he's a very good friend and he speaks to me very nicely on the phone. I remember reading a book. They said when the Taliban, after talking with Trump was on the plane. They told him, Mr. President, this is a bad idea to negotiate with the Taliban. And he said, yeah, but did you see how they call me Your Excellency? Trump could well turn to his advisors and say that Erdogan, I like him. He's a really good guy. He's just misunderstood. And he's promised he'll look after our interests. Let him do so. And that's why I think that the separatist Kurds are terrified of Trump, terrified of US policy, terrified of the rebel advance, and also terrified of the position of Assad, because if he falls, their dream of autonomy is finished.
Sami, is there any truth in the idea that Assad is central to this axis of resistance and Syria is a main supply route for Hezbollah, and Hezbollah, of course, has been involved in activities on the southern border, and so by extension, there is an advantage in creating this mayhem or messiness in Syria because it damages the potential for Iran to supply Hezbollah and for the continuation of this struggle. And so I suppose the argument then is that what's happening in Syria will undermine Gaza. What's your take on that?
I think the first thing is the idea that the subjugation of Syria and the brutalization of the Syrian people is a requirement to rescue Palestine is an absurd and perverse premise to even begin the discussion in the first place. I believe that the subjugation of the Iraqi people and slaughtering them through militias in the name of Fatima and Hussein is a prerequisite for the liberation of Palestine and Al-Aqsa, or that we should ignore that for the sake of Palestine and Al-Aqsa is a perverse premise to begin on. I think that when you look at, for example, the premise that we need to neglect the displacement of millions of Syrians in Syria, because that's the way that we're going to liberate Palestine by oppressing our own, and that we should turn a blind eye to oppression to deliver justice for Palestine, ما بني على باطل فهو باطل. I don't think that's how the liberation of Palestine comes about. So I think the very premise in and of itself, it's important to call things as they are. This is what is being asked by those who support Bashar al-Assad. Yes, he's bad. Yes, he's brutal. Yes, he's a dictator. Yes, he slaughters his population. Yes, he displaces millions from their homes, but Palestine. And I think even Palestinians don't accept this, which is why I think we've seen recently Sheikh Omar Suleiman and even Palestinians in Gaza itself saying, oh, Syria, your liberation is not separate from ours. The second point that is worth noting is that it is true that the Israelis don't like the Iranians and that Iranians dream of defeating the Israelis. That is true. It is also true that Syria is part of this bridge that the Iranians believe needs to be established in order to reach Hezbollah and the like. However, the idea that Assad is an essential part of the axis of resistance, I think is over exaggerated, because I think his presence and his oppression of Syria paralyzes Syria and renders it impotent to be able to even stand up against the Israelis. I think the way that he holds on to power in Syria and subjugates the Syrian people and spends all of his resources on staying in power at the expense of the Syrians. Remember, bear in mind, if Assad had delivered justice, bear in mind, people often, they don't even ask for democracy. The reason people ask for democracy is when they have no avenue to the ruler. When people are asking for democracy, it means we don't like the way this guy has ruled. But if, because you look at, for example, some of the Gulf states, you see some of the people there, they're not in a rush to call for democracy. Why? Because a lot of them are provided for, whether it's in Doha or it's in some of these other places. I'm not justifying the system or the monarchy system or anything like that. What I'm saying is that governance in and of itself is the idea of provision for the people. If Assad provided justice for the Syrians, I don't think there would be as many calls for democracy as there are today, because justice prevails all around, and it doesn't matter what that system is. In the Quran, you have Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman alayhi salam and his kingdoms. In the Prophet sallam, you have the Shura. In other people, you have Yusuf alayhi salam as an advisor, Al Aziz. Many different systems. There's no point going into much detail on that. My point is, Assad's oppression is what makes Syria impotent. You think the genocide has been going on for 12 months. What has come out of Syria? Where has the Syrian army been? What has the Syrian army done? Where has Syria been a threat to the Israelis in any way whatsoever? In fact, Israel has bombed Syria with no response. People will say it's because of the rebellion, but what caused the rebellion? The oppression of Bashar al-Assad. And that's why I argue that the axis of resistance in and of itself, it cannot be that you throw rockets at the Israelis, but you slaughter thousands of Muslims and then pave the road for the liberation of Palestine with the blood of the Sunni populations that you are killing and displacing. For those who are following the Twitter of Syrians, you'll notice that there are references to green buses. Those green buses, Jalal, are references to buses that Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, would load Sunnis on from southern areas in Syria and tell them, if you want to live, you go north towards Idlib. And he would bring a Shia from Pakistan, from India, from Afghanistan, bring a Shia from Iraq and the like to occupy those homes. Why? He said, I need to build a Shia bridge from Tehran all the way to Beirut. Now, it may well be that it is to liberate Palestine. I don't deny that they have that aim at all. What I'm saying is the liberation of Palestine does not look like the Iranian Safawi liberation, does not look like the liberation that we talk about here and there. Because we talk about the liberation of Syria, of Iraq, of Yemen, of Lebanon, and of Palestine and of Egypt. And they talk about the liberation of Palestine on the back of the subjugation of every other country in that place, because Palestine is superior to all of them. Now, while in the Quran it's blessed definitely superior in terms of its references or the like, I think that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, Umar ibn al-Khattab, when you look at how Palestine has been liberated before, it's been liberated through Egypt and through Sham, through Egypt and through Syria. Those two need to be liberated if you want to liberate Palestine itself. And that's why I argue that Assad may not like the Israelis, and the Israelis may not like him, but he is unwittingly the obstacle to liberation by virtue of hanging on to power and not establishing a system through which justice can prevail so the Syrians can live with dignity and actually be able to focus on outside instead of their own internal issues in and of themselves. The second point worth noting is that there has been, as been suggested by your question, that Assad is integral because he's the bridge that allows weapons to go to Hezbollah for them to antagonize the Israelis and the like, and that it's been allowed the weapons to go across. And the reality is that Hezbollah was not focused on Israel. Those weapons were not being sent to fight Israel. Those weapons were being sent to fight Syria. When Lebanon was being bombed into oblivion by the Israelis, Hezbollah refused to withdraw their troops from Syria to come and help, because they believe that we can lose Lebanon but not Syria, that we can allow the south to be devastated, but let's not lose Syria. Hezbollah had no interest in crossing the border to go and rescue Syria, but when the Iranians asked of it, they crossed in and they bombarded it and they went and slaughtered. Those videos of Yarmouk are still very vivid, 2014, holding up these flags, were taking revenge for Sayyidina al-Hussein against the descendants of Yazid, and they would bomb the daylights out of those villages in and of themselves. So the idea that Assad is an axis of resistance is correct. Resistance against Muslims, resistance against freedom, resistance against dignity, resistance against the legitimate rights of populations. It's not resistance against the Israelis. That's not the priority. I know that the last time this clip got cut, I got in trouble for it. But Israel is not the priority. Weapons go to Hezbollah, not to hit the Israelis, but to hit the Muslims in Syria, to subjugate the Muslims in Syria, to subjugate the other sects and groups in Syria in and of itself. And that's why I think for the Syrians, if this chain is broken, then it's a welcome thing. It's something to welcome because it was never intended for the Israelis. It was intended for the Syrians and the Muslims there too. And now that it's been broken, now that Hezbollah's capabilities have been broken, the road to Aleppo was opened. The road to Hama was opened. And the road to Damascus could open too as a result of the weakening of this chain, which shows that it wasn't built for Israel, it was built for Syria itself. And that's why I argue that people say things, but wala taqrabu salah, it's a half truth. He is an axis of resistance, but not to Israel. He's an axis of resistance to the freedom and dignity and rights of the Syrian people.
Sami, did Hezbollah fail when it signed or that ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah? Was it a marker of Hezbollah's failure in resisting Israel on the southern border?
I think that first and foremost, it's important to note that Hezbollah did not need to get involved in Gaza. It could have done like the UAE and said, I'm not getting involved. It could have been like bin Salman and said to the Israelis, go for it. If you're going after Hamas and going after the Iranian proxies, go for it. It has nothing to do with me. I think that Hassan Nasrallah knew that he would pay a heavy price if he intervened, and I don't think he was happy with October 7th. The reason why I say this, it's important to note that although these Iranian militias have inflicted havoc and grief on the Muslim world in the name of this ideology that they believe in, which not all Shias subscribe to, let me make that frank, not all Shias subscribe to that ideology, I do think in that heart somewhere is a legitimate desire to see Palestine to be free. Even if perhaps I don't believe it's the same vision that we have, I believe that their liberated Palestine is one that curses Sahaba, but I do believe that they have a sincerity in which they want to liberate Palestine, and I think that they were sincere in their sacrifice for Palestine. Same with the Houthis, who are on the verge of signing an agreement with the Saudis to recognize the internationally recognized government, and then they scuppered that opportunity by going to stand for Gaza itself. They believe in the cause. I accept that wholeheartedly. I think that there is speculation that I think that one of the reasons why Hezbollah agreed to the ceasefire and agreed to terms that Hezbollah would not usually agree to, i.e. allowing the Israelis to bomb Lebanon when they want, to enter Lebanon when they want, to allow the Lebanese army to occupy areas or not to occupy, but to enter areas in the south where Hezbollah are. I think that had to do with the threat that was emerging in Syria. That we can always come back to Lebanon, but we cannot lose Syria. That we can always come back to the Israelis, but we cannot lose Syria. We cannot allow the Syrian people to liberate Syria. So we're going to make peace with the Israelis and go and attack the Syrians. And that's why I think the Israelis are laughing and saying, well, you've signed the ceasefire agreement. We're still bombing Lebanon. You're still claiming the ceasefire agreement is still in effect. And that's why I think it's the Israelis who got the better terms of the deal. But at the same time, Hezbollah had been able to prevent the Israelis from taking villages in Lebanon. They're still a thorn in the side of the Israelis. They're still causing issues for the Israelis. They're still causing complications for Netanyahu. But I think that it is clear, as has been clear throughout the genocide, that Israel, as far as Hezbollah are concerned, is a distraction. It was something that is an engagement that wasn't meant to happen now. That privately they are saying, why did you have to do this, Yahya Sinwar, at this moment in time when we have greater priorities? And I think that the Syria has essentially exposed that they could have said to the Syrian rebels fighting Assad, that may Allah give you tawfiq and may you Syrians, have freedom and let's work together against the Israelis. Their position instead is, over my dead body will I allow you to take down this dictator Bashar al-Assad. I don't care what he does to Syrian people. I will not allow him to do so. I will make peace with Israel and go and attack you rather than continue to defeat the Israelis and partnering up with you to go and defeat the Israelis in and of themselves. So I think that the ceasefire agreement, I think Hezbollah, I don't like saying this publicly, I think that Hezbollah militarily frustrated the Israelis. They agreed to terms that they would not ordinarily agree to, but I think the Israelis will not be able to take advantage of it because they don't have the ability to defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's my personal opinion here and there. But I mean, it's always a bit darker than it seems. But I think overall, because the suggestion is that Israel is winning, Israel is not. Israel also agreed to the ceasefire because they're also aware in and of themselves that we need a way out of Lebanon. We can't keep staying in Lebanon in and of itself. There's no victory to be had Biden is struggling to topple the government and reform it. Times of Israel is reporting that Trump might not be as eager to support the genocide as Biden has. Times of Israel actually reported that Trump told Netanyahu, you have until I arrive to the White House. As soon as I enter the White House, this better be done. I don't want this going on while I'm there. I want to be the guy who says, I fixed what Biden broke. I think the Israelis also accepted the ceasefire because although Hezbollah accepted terms they would not ordinarily accept, Netanyahu accepted a ceasefire he would not ordinarily accept. Because I think they're both hurt. They're both in difficult situations. They're both struggling for a strategic victory. Hezbollah, not so much against the Israelis, but more so in Syria in and of themselves. And so they are both saying to each other, we've hammered each other. Let's come to some sort of agreement. Let me go focus on Syria. And Israel is saying, I'm going to go focus on Gaza. And I think now Biden, to try to rescue his legacy, might be now seriously pushing for a ceasefire, but we'll see where it goes.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today, Sami. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help our brothers and sisters in Syria and in Gaza and beyond, inshallah, and bring justice to the Muslim world, inshallah.
Barakallahu feek. Assalamu alaikum.
Start.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.